Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to talk about AI and AI art and about progressivism and progressive art and why both of them are not only linked together, but linked together in how bad that they are. And indeed, why I think neither of them actually have a future. And of course, I got to thinking about this because I was thinking about heroism, and I'll get to that at the very end. But one of the other reasons I've been thinking about this was because I ran across an article which had a very good title. It was, "Why Are We Blindly Driving Towards a Future That No One Wants?" And it was discussing this in terms of AI. I also wanted to add that this is more one of my symposium videos where I talk about different sorts of ideas and bring them up rather than a very cohesive argument. So if you're one of those people who usually puts in the comments something like, you need to tighten up your videos, that could have been said in 5 minutes, this video is probably not your style. So to start right off, to talk about the connection that I see between AI art and progressive art, and I would also include in that area of description postmodern art and modern art as well. The problem with all of these things is that, quite simply, they have no soul. Now, we'll get into a little bit of what that actually means, but I think that's at the heart of what the problem is with each of these things. They have no soul. Or to put it another way, as I have said in other videos, there's a difference between using a formula in order to create art and being formulaic. And that's where I want to start. I remember a line from a movie. I cannot for the life of me remember what this movie was, whether it was a piece of Shakespeare or if it was simply a 1950s movie about the ancient world set in a very Shakespearean milieu, I guess is the best way to put it. But within that movie, there was a line wherein the characters were looking at the beautiful busts and sculptures around them, one's done, of course, in that ancient form. And one of the characters asked another, "Why is it that the eyes of a statue are always so lifeless? The statues themselves have such life to them, but they always have dead eyes." And yes, I know they most probably painted the statues in ancient times and painted the eyes and everything else and gave them a little bit more life. But still, let's pull on that thread for a minute. It's the fact that you have these statues and they're magnificently beautiful. And they indeed follow a very strict formula. Someone actually took something like, I don't know, the Fibonacci equation and applied it to most ancient Greek sculptures, and they were able to find that they could be all reduced to a certain formula. So yeah, they did follow a very specific formula, but they were used in such a way in order to express life and movement. But at the same time, they always had dead eye. Now, there's a couple of ways I can go with this, but let's keep on the ancient world way. And it's the fact that, sure, they had dead eyes. And why? Because they had no soul. As much life as you could put into that marble and make it look like it was alive, it still has no soul. It was shaped by someone with a soul, and you can clearly see that, even through the formula that they're using, but it itself has no soul. So there's a difference between art, which of course is not a living thing, and art that has no soul at all. And the point of me saying all of that is to say that it's not the formula that discounts it having no soul. It's not the fact that the thing itself cannot have a soul, that it does not have what I would call a soul in art, which is the soulless capacity of postmodern art, modern art, AI art, progressive art, but it was more the way it was created. Now, a couple of interesting sidetracks on this. This is kind of one of the subjects that Augustine of Hippo goes into in one of his chapters in his books. He talks about an ancient movement that tried over and over again to basically use magic to trap demons in sculptures. And what would they be doing then? Well, what they were trying to do was to give that sculpture more life and to give it a soul. This was an actual ancient practice. Augustine, of course, saying this is a pagan practice. I can't remember what the actual name of it was. It has an actual name. Now, another interesting sidetrack is the fact that if you look at something much more modern day, if we look at comic book art, if you know anything about it, you know that the American superhero comic book art developed a formula for how to actually draw people to make them look like they were more dynamic and alive on a two-dimensional page. It was created, I think, by the person who did, I think it was Tarzan back in the 1930s. So he figured out a way to make a person on a two-dimensional page look more alive, look more like they were in the middle of movement, but he did so by skewing the proportions of an actual human being, which is something, again, that goes all the way back in history. If you look at something like the Parthenon, if you're a human being standing in front of the Parthenon, looking at the pillars, you would say, wow, those are exactly straight. How did they do that? But if you take a closer look and actually had levels or instruments in order to measure these things, you know what? They're not actually straight. And they knew that when they built it. And they built it exactly that way to appear straight. And they knew exactly how, with exacting proportions, to use the tilt in this entire building in order to make it look straight. Now, anybody who knows anything about carpentry would know that, yeah, you do that all the time. It's the difference between straight and true. You can either make it straight and level, or you can make it look straight and level. And no, those two things do not always coincide. Sometimes they do, but not always. And that's what they did with comic book art over the last century. They figured out a way to make it look true, even though it wasn't straight. And moreover, this whole conversation reminds me of a quote, which I don't know if it originated with Neil Adams, but Neil Adams, which, by the way, you're probably looking at Neil Adams' art in the background, so that's why that's there. Neil Adams had said at one point, the style of an artist is the culmination of all his mistakes. Which is to say what? Which is to say, sure, you can use this formula. Sure, this formula may be the difference between straight and true. It may be the difference between making it look more alive or not, but it's not actually alive. We know that. That's number one. And number two, the actual character of that art comes from not just your ability to follow that pattern, but also your inability to follow that pattern, which is another way to say your human quality to make mistakes. Now, let's go back to AI art for a second. If we look at AI art, sure, it does this thing which the ancients did and people have done throughout history. It is comparing a lot of things that it finds, and it is building a formula based upon all of those examples of what it is looking for. And then it uses that formula in order to create its own so-called piece of art. But at the same time, that art and that use of that formula is soulless. Why and how? Well, I think to answer the why and how, let's look at the other end of the spectrum. The messiest form of humanity actually trying to create so-called art, and how they do the same basic thing, and how indeed, even though it is created by people, it's still soulless. This would be progressive art. Which, by the way, slight sidetrack here again, I also think this includes everything in between. It includes postmodern art. It includes modern art. And when I say modern art, I don't just mean these abstract pieces of art. I also mean, to some extent, a lot of the art created under a modern philosophy, the philosophy of modernism. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I will give you an example. I would say that film noir is art based to some extent on modernist philosophy. Now, what does that mean? Well, first of all, you have to distinguish between a film noir aesthetic and the actual meaning of film noir. Even I myself, I'm using the film noir aesthetic within one of my upcoming books. It is mostly black and white, but not all. There's a little bit of dash of color in there over and over again. But the point is that film noir, if you follow it in a philosophical term, it is the absence of anything and everything that has to do with the supernatural. It's only worldly. That's it. If you take a supernatural element and put it into a so-called film noir film, it's no longer technically film noir. It may have film noir aesthetic, but it's not film noir. That's why I describe my upcoming book as film noir meets Indiana Jones. Why? Because Indiana Jones has a lot of spiritual aspects to it, so it's not technical film noir. And also, which is really funny, since film noir was created in a time of black and white film, it is much more dependent upon heavy elements of black and white, which feed into a more materialistic way of thinking, which is indeed black and white. But I'll get into that more a little bit later. But let's look at progressive art for a second. I think that many people, especially people listening to my channel, would look at progressive art and say, yeah, this is soulless. Now, first of all, let's look at it in a more studio format rather than an individual format. In the studios, if they're going to make a show or a movie now, what is it not only that makes it more progressive and inclusive, but also makes it soulless? Well, that's the fact that they're being formulaic. They're not just following a formula, they're following a formula to the extent that it kills any kind of soul that this piece of art might actually have had at one point. There's really good examples of this all over the world. If you look at anime, you can see the exact thing that I'm talking about. For example, if you take isekai, yes, I understand isekai, which is basically in another world, set story, existed before what I'm about to talk about. But the thing that really blew it up was Sword Art Online. And after you had that show, since it had such great success, there were people trying to imitate it over and over again, and it became its own genre, I guess. And you did have some imitators actually do somewhere between not too bad to pretty good with trying to come up with their own take on that formula set down by Sword Art Online. Things like Log Horizon weren't too bad. Rising of the Shield Hero, that was pretty good. And a whole plethora of others. But for every show that actually did something real with this genre, there was 50 shows that just followed a formula to try to imitate the exact thing that came out last time that made some money. And it was so formulaic that it becomes bland. It is indeed soulless. These are shows and movies which are created by a committee. But let's delve into this a little further. Let's look at a progressive artist that I've covered before on this channel. A number of years ago, I did a video about Marika Tamaki. Now, if you don't know who she is, she's a comic book writer. She's worked for both Marvel and DC. You probably know her stuff tangentially through the fact that the She-Hulk, the progressive, awful She-Hulk series that was on television, was mostly based upon Marika Tamaki's writing for that character in comics. But anyway, I did a video about Marika Tamaki covering an interview that she did with, I think it was the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. I can't remember off the top of my head. She's Canadian. Anyways. And I titled that video something like, Marika Tamaki, the best comic book writer that will never write a good comic. Now, why? Because I listened to her philosophy in that interview behind how she thinks about everything, including human beings, and it is completely soulless. And I don't mean that in an abstract way either. She was talking about how human beings, yes, we recognize patterns that are presented to us, but nothing new ever comes from us itself. We never generate anything new. All you do from the time you're a little baby is take in input of things that happen around you. You take the memory of what is presented to you, you put it in a storehouse in your brain, like a giant museum, and every once in a while, you take some artifacts out of that storehouse and display them in your own museum, which is your actions in life. And so, all it is for human beings is monkey see, monkey do. All it is for human beings is to copy the patterns of what they've seen before. There's no actual free will. There's no actual choice. There's no actual creation. But at the same time, I know from looking at her work and some of the things that she said and listening to interviews, she knows very well how to write. She knows very well the patterns and the recognition of patterns that need to be used in order to write something that is technically well put down, but it's always going to be soulless if that's the way she thinks about human beings. So the question becomes, what ties all of these random things that I've been talking about together and make them different from something like the ancient Greek sculpture? Well, here's the thing. Progressivism is a form of postmodernism. And what is postmodernism? Postmodernism is quite literally the French version of critical theory, because the French will never use anything, especially German things. They have to come up with their own version of it in order to use it. Quite literally, they have a government body that is set up to create new French words should a non-French word start to enter into the French vocabulary. And above all, they do not like to use German things. And critical theory was a German set of ideas. So they came up with their own set of ideas and called it postmodernism. But it's the exact same thing, just in a French form. And so, what is critical theory? Well, critical theory, literally, as the critical theorists themselves say, is a form of Marxism, wherein they sat down and said, okay, our grand communist revolution via the workers of the world uniting is not happening. Therefore, we have to come up with a different way in order to start this revolution and keep it going. And then they came up with critical theory. It's basically to use criticism constantly and relentlessly in order to chip away at the underpinnings of civilization until they fall over. The French in postmodernism just do it in a more artistic way. But here's the point that ties everything together. The point is that progressivism and postmodernism, and to some extent modernism itself, are soulless because they downplay, at the very least, or exclude, at the very worst, any concept of the value of the individual. So for something like film noir, it's to say, no, it has no soul, technically, because we want to drain out the idea of a soul itself. If you look at progressive art, it's based upon the fact that, no, the individual doesn't matter. It's the group that matters. And so if the individual doesn't matter, that's a roundabout way of saying, no, you don't have an individual soul that makes you unique. That's why you don't matter. And therefore, no, you don't need to put a soul into this art because there's no such thing. No such thing that means anything anyways. But as I said at the first, I was going to discuss a little bit about what it means to have a soul. And I'll give you that through a little bit of a sidetrack of my own personal experience. When I wrote my thesis for my master's, which was basically a giant paper about classical political theory, what I did was I did it about inspiration. Now, I was studying Plato and Aristotle. I basically said Plato and Aristotle are a culmination of the idea of inspiration that had preceded them in all Greek culture. So what I did was I read basically everything written in Greek that I could get my hands on at that point, because you just had your library and concordances. And I studied all of those to look for a pattern within the idea of inspiration. And there is indeed a very distinct pattern of inspiration, I would say, within that Greek culture, going all the way back to as far as we can within the written works of the Greeks. And I basically said something like, okay, let's take Homer. He knows on one end of the spectrum, the basic, if he was an actual person, one person, he knows the basic historical events of the Iliad. He also knows the basic structure of how Greek society works in his day and how it worked previous to him. He could take those 2 points and from those 2 points on the opposite side of the spectrum, fill in all of the other central points of this tale simply by using the formula that was generated from those 2 things. For example, we know that certain number of Greeks are going to pull up on this shore. Okay, if they're going to do that, what are they going to do first? Well, according to custom, they would do X, Y, and Z. If they would have a council, in this council of kings from all over Greece, who would speak first? Well, we know that from custom, it would be the high king. And what would he say? Well, he would say X first, etc., and going down the line. That would be a basic form of inspiration. As Homer keeps on saying, inspire me, O muse. But in addition to that, I also did something within this paper which severely ticked off, well, basically all of the professors I was working with. And what was that? Well, I also said that in examining this language, and especially very specific points in this language, and concepts like doom or fate, moira, ate or ate, however you say it in Greek, thumos, phneumatos, all of these things. In looking at all of these things, as understood by the writers who said them and used them in different formats, right up until Plato and Aristotle, they all believed in inspiration, and that inspiration came from a supernatural source to some extent. So I did not discount the idea that at the very least, as you ascend the steps of inspiration and learn how to be inspired from things like historical events or cultural norms, you can get to a point wherein the spiritual will actually draw you upwards instead of you climbing the stairs. At the very least, that should be a possibility in our examination of this entire thing, especially if we're looking at Plato and Aristotle, who themselves had ideas like the good, the true, the good, the beautiful, abstract ideas, philosophical, spiritual ideas, things like the prime mover. But here was my problem. I was working in the system of a liberal arts education. And even though that was based upon, in its very beginning, Renaissance rediscovery of Plato and Aristotle, it always has a stopping point. And that stopping point is, yeah, no, you can't put anything spiritual into this. No, sorry. You can't even assume or even argue that there might be a basis of something spiritual. Even though, of course, the very 2 thinkers that the entire system was based upon, which is Plato and Aristotle, themselves saw a lot of these things as leading to the spiritual. And indeed, inspiration itself, if we look at the Latin word, it's spiritus, the divine breath. If we look at it in Greek terms like pneumatos, that's a word that can mean either breath or life, but it can also mean spirit or soul. And so you had these ancient artists who desperately wanted their art to come alive, so much so that they even delved at times into, well, basically black magic in order to try to make them alive. That's how much they wanted them to be alive. But if they were just artists, they employed everything in their power in order to create that art in a way that gave it as much life as possible. And part of that was inspiration, and part of that inspiration itself includes the idea of, at the very least, giving it a soul in its process of creation. I guess that's kind of vague. I guess it would be more the fact that the soul of the artist who was creating it was drawn upwards by something greater than himself, something spiritual when actually creating this thing. And such inspiration could, in at least a small way, be transferred into the medium whereby that art was being created, and thus give it a quote-unquote soul. And the thing about inspiration is its individuation. You can't have a group of people that are inspired. You can have an individual artist who are inspired. Why? Because the inspiration works on your soul, and there is no collective soul. And this is where the entire thing ties into the concept of hero, because the heroic, if you look at the traditional way of looking at it as a paragon of virtue, if you go back to the ancient times, it also works in an individual way. Not only was one of the ancient ideas of a hero the idea of picking the best individual out of your army to fight the best individual on the other side, but the concept of hero, which is a paragon of virtue, is based upon very specific virtues, and virtues themselves work in an individual way. Just by going over the definitions of virtue as laid down by Augustine of Hippo, which is important. Why? Because Augustine of Hippo literally changed the definition of what will meant, which is the definition we still use today. He came up with this in the 4th century and defined will as an individual thing, distinguishing it from the older concepts of will, which was only semi-individualistic. But he describes virtue in a technical sense as, and I'm paraphrasing, the power to accomplish one's ends. Now, of course, those ends are talking about bigger ends that are originating from your human nature and everything else. But the key point here is one's ends. It is talking about one. It is talking about an individual. Moreover, when he goes to the more poetic side of the spectrum in defining virtue, he says, this is a short definition of what virtue is. Virtue is the order of love. As he quotes, the psalmist says, "O God, order love within me." Which again, focusing on the key parts here, is God, which is the spiritual, order something within me. Not within us, not within society, within me, the individual. And oh, by the way, the individual is so important in our culture because theologically, every individual has a soul which has the stamp and image of God on it. That's why it is so important, and at the same time, that stamp on your soul is also the thing that makes you absolutely unique. And being unique, you at the same time have not only value, but unique value. You are a locus of intrinsic value, and that value, again, is unique. There's only one of you. You can never be replaced by anyone else. And so, if you were to imitate your creator and create something through inspiration, through the employment of your soul, you're creating something unique. But in a system, a modern system that declares, no, we're going to erase the board so that there's no spiritual on there at all, to a postmodern, progressive system where they say, no, the individual doesn't matter at all. This is why their attempts at art are soulless. This is why they believe that they can create something via committee and have it be as impactful as an inspired, timeless piece of art. And this is the answer to the question that I asked at the very first of this video. That was the title of that article I ran across. The title being, why are we driving towards a future that no one wants? In discussing AI in that article, they answered the question, I think, in the title itself. Why are we driving towards a future that no one wants? No one wants it because the individuals don't want it. We want it because they're talking about society. They're talking about the collective. They're talking about the distinction between what the collective wants and what the individual wants. The collective wants something like AI art because the collective has no soul. Because the collective thinks there's only the collective. The individual doesn't want these things because the individual knows that they are a unique individual. Moreover, I would say this is exactly the point of why individuals can say, I'm looking at this piece of art and I can tell it was made by AI. I can tell it is soulless. That kind of a thing, I don't think no matter how good AI gets, it's never going to be able to overcome. And it's the same limitation as progressive so-called art. And just as we are now finally getting to a point where we look at progressive, quote unquote, art and say, yeah, no one wants this, let's move past it. I think we're going to get to that exact same point. Maybe it'll take a generation or two, but that exact same point with AI art. In ancient terms, it's the difference between techne, technology, and actual art. Machines can create techne. Machines cannot create art. What you're looking at is not actually a piece of art. It has no soul. It was not created by an individual with a soul. It has nothing unique to it at all. Whether it be its advantages, whether it be its connection to the true, the good, or the beautiful, or its connection to the failings of that artist. There's nothing human there, and there's nothing divine there. It's simply lifeless eyes looking back at you. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and if you made it this far into this rambling video, kudos on you, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about this entire thing. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.